In this video, we'll be discussing health communications. We'll begin with a short thought experiment. Consider this. Suppose there's a new disease out there, a new epidemic, and it's going to affect 600 people in your town. Suppose you're a doctor and you have to choose one of two possible courses of action for your town. First, take a moment to choose which of these two courses of action seems most attractive to you. Using treatment plan A, you can save 200 people for sure, or using treatment plan B, there's a 1 in 3 chance that you'll save all 600 people, but a 2 out of 3 chance that you won't save anybody at all. Now consider these two treatment plans. Which seems more attractive to you? Using treatment plan C, 400 people will certainly die. Or using treatment plan D, there's a 2 out of 3 chance that all 600 people will die, and a 1 in 3 chance that nobody will die. We'll come back to that in a moment. But for now, let's move on to our discussion of health behaviors and how we can get people to change them. So the first thing I want to do is just convince you, hopefully, again, that your health behaviors matter. In the very beginning of the term, I showed you this slide of the top causes of death in this country, and I pointed out that most of those diseases are linked to health behaviors, things like smoking, using drugs, eating a high cholesterol diet, and leading a sedentary lifestyle. And this is the slide showing you that those behaviors are associated. These kinds of unhealthy behaviors are associated with the most common causes of death in America. Just take a moment and notice all of the diseases that are linked to health behaviors. In fact, the top 4 illnesses are related to smoking. Heart disease is related not only to smoking, but also to diet and having a sedentary lifestyle. Accidents are related to alcohol and drugs, and diet and leading a sedentary lifestyle are predictors of diabetes. Heart disease, cancers, and stroke account for 50% of deaths each year, and all 3 of these causes have strong behavioral components. To give you a more global perspective, 5.3 million of the 57 million deaths worldwide in 2008 could be attributed to inactivity. This is because inactivity plays a large role in the development of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, breast cancer, and colon cancer. If physical inactivity could be reduced by 25%, then 1.3 million deaths a year could be prevented. So clearly, our behaviors play a large role in our overall health and eventually to our mortality. In the 1970s, 2 researchers conducted a study to determine the importance of health habits. They surveyed almost 7,000 residents in Alameda County, California. Specifically, they asked them about the healthy habits that they practiced. Also, these researchers asked their participants how many illnesses they had contracted and which illnesses they had over a 6 to 12 month period, as well as how much energy they had and how disabled they had been. These researchers also made sure to follow up with their participants 9 to 12 years later. Here's their list of important health behaviors. Just take a moment and give yourself a point for each behavior that you engage in. If you got 0 to 3 of these behaviors, these researchers would categorize you as being the least healthy. If you got 4 to 6 points, you're in the middle health-wise, and if you got a score of 7, you would be considered the healthiest. Here are the results from the study these researchers started in the 1970s. The x-axis shows the number of those health behaviors you do, and the y-axis shows the percent of people who died over the 9-year study. Each line on the graph shows a different age group, so the oldest group, 75 years and over, is the top line. And you can see that they, of course, had the most people die. But notice that there's a strong relationship between the number of healthy behaviors you do and your odds of dying. The more healthy behaviors you engage in, the lower your odds of dying. And you can see on this graph the relationship gets stronger as you get older. Notice that for people 75 and older who do all 7 health behaviors, these people have the health of an average 65-year-old. The differences get more pronounced as you get older, reflecting a gradual accumulation of damage. You might be thinking that this is kind of a stupid graph, and in some ways I'd have to agree with you. This study shouldn't probably equate all these behaviors as if they were equally dangerous. Smoking's obviously more dangerous than deciding to have a snack between meals from time to time, or at least that's my intuition. But the point I want to make here is pretty safely made. These behaviors have a strong effect on health, and these behaviors do add up over time. So clearly, if health behaviors can have such a large impact on our lives, then learning about how we can persuade people to change their behaviors is a very important area of health psychology. In this video, we're going to focus on the way persuasive health messages are communicated. The 2 aspects that we're going to talk about here are 1, how should you frame your health communication, and 2, how can you reduce people's defensiveness when they hear a health communication that pertains to them. We'll begin by a discussion of message framing. There are lots of different ways to present the same information. If you want to convince somebody to get a flu shot, should you tell them about all the bad things that can happen if they don't get a flu shot? Or should you tell them about all the good things that could happen if they do get a flu shot? These 2 types of different information represent examples of different ways to frame information. You can focus on the positive aspects of changing a behavior, or you can focus on the negative aspects of not changing a behavior. If you focus on the positive aspects of performing a behavior, you're using a gain-framed message. A gain-framed message is a message that focuses on what can be gained by doing a behavior. In other words, these messages tell you the benefits associated with performing some specific behavior. If you focus on the negative aspects of not performing a behavior, you're using a loss-framed message. A loss-framed message is a message that focuses on what you might lose if you don't do the behavior. So these messages tell you the negative consequences associated with not performing some specific behavior. Now let's watch a short clip that explains further how framing can influence the ways in which we make decisions.
So here, in a nutshell, is your guide to logical decision-making. Identify all the factors that affect the decision. Write them down. Even weight them using mathematics. And remember, freeing your mind with maths could help you become a truly rational person. But of course, it's not quite that simple. Problem is that you routinely come to quite different conclusions about the same problem, depending on how you look at it, which isn't very rational at all. Pete Furman is a magician. He can confuse, misdirect, and bamboozle.
So 51 are face up. Only one is face down. What was it? 7 of hearts. 7 of hearts. Take it out. Turn it face up. The 7 of hearts. Oh. Thanks, guys. Cheers.
Today, Pete's in London's Spitalfields market working for us, and he wants to give away our money.
Inside my pocket, I've got 20 quid, 20 pounds, 30, 40, 50 pounds. Feel it, touch it. You can walk away with that. Or, if you want to, we could have a little game of roulette, 50-50 odds, and you can up it to 50 quid. But if you lose, you get nothing. I get the 20 back.
The decision to take the 20 or gamble is theirs alone, except that what they don't know is that Pete is manipulating them.
You know, even odds. That's a trick, isn't it? No, it's not a trick. If you want to, you can walk around.
The way he presents the proposition is subtly different.
Money. I'm going to give you 20 quid.
In the first case, the punter is presented with a freebie, a nice surprise. This is called a gain scenario.
Here's 20 quid. You take that. You can take that, you can walk away, it's yours. Go and buy lunch, whatever you want to do. Or you can gamble and maybe win 50. What do you want to do? Okay, I've got 10, 20...
In the second case, the punter gets an even nicer surprise.
Actually, wait a minute. Real money here, I've got 50 quid, all right? That's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 quid. That's yours, okay?
But is then almost immediately presented with what is called a loss scenario.
I'm going to take 30 of it back. If you want to win this, you're going to have to gamble. What do you want to do?
The outcome to both scenarios is identical. Keep 20 or gamble for 50. We want to see if the decision to gamble can be affected by the way that the proposition is made.
I'll gamble.
You'll gamble?
I'll gamble.
Okay.
In our rigorously scientific study in Spitalfields Market, those who felt they were losing out were more likely to gamble to win the money back.
Red, Desmond, 50 pounds. Congratulations.
As opposed to those punters who were presented with a gain.
Here's 20 quid, all right?
Who decided to stick with their unexpected good fortune.
I'm gonna keep the money.
You're going to keep the money? Well done, but fair enough, sir. Fair enough.
Without realizing it, our volunteers had decided on risk.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's a red, so I keep the money.
Or safety.
I'm going to walk away.
You're going to walk away?
Yeah.
Fair enough. Have it my compliments.
Simply because of perception of loss or gain.
Okay, Jessica, now I'll tell you the instruction for playing this game. So you're going to enter in that scanner. You have two options. One option you can keep for sure, £30. That is a safe option. Or you can feel a bit more risky and play a gamble, in which you can win all £50 or lose all of them, okay?
Benedetto Di Martino is performing the same experiment that we tried out in Spitalfields Market. By performing the gambling experiment in the fMRI scanner, Benedetto is hoping to see what is going on in the brain of the person making decisions in the face of loss or gain.
Okay, Jessica, we are starting now the experiment. Good luck. Try to make as much money as you can.
Each new loss or gain scenario is called a frame. Benedetto's experiment contains hundreds of variations on the theme. Pairs of identical choices, presented in subtly different ways. Across the board, just as in the street experiment, the loss frames produced more inclination to gamble than the gain frames. This so-called framing effect was first observed 30 years ago. Psychologists discovered that if a decision is taken to avoid a loss, it will be a bolder, more aggressive decision than one taken to merely achieve a gain. The idea is called prospect theory and explains an awful lot of apparently irrational decisions. New York taxi drivers tend to determine their hours of work by their earnings. When they reach their target, they go home. Though this seems sensible, it does reveal a lapse in rational thought. Because on slow days, the taxi driver motivated by the loss of not reaching the target, will work for more hours than on a fast day, where the gain of greater earnings once the target has been quickly reached does not produce the desire to continue working. Of course, it would be more rational to work longer on a fast day and knock off early on a slow day. But this is nothing to do with logic.
Main bedroom.
Perception of loss or gain drives human decision-making in every aspect of existence, from choosing where to live
Dylan doesn't like it.
to deciding to go to war. Prospect theory observes that we are not always rational about decisions. But it was not until Benedetto scanned his gamblers that anyone could understand why.
What we found, and what was already described 30 years ago by prospect theory, the fact that people are not completely rational, and also that the fact that the emotion, they play a big role in the decision.
What Benedetto discovered was that in every case, it was the emotional center of the brain, the amygdala, which lit up.
On contrary of what is the common sense that people that are very rational, they don't have emotion at all. We found that every one of us process emotion, but there are some people who can kind of control this initial emotional response that every one of us has.
But Benedetto discovered something more. He noticed that there was a part of the frontal lobe that was also active during the decision-making task. But the amount of activity varied dramatically between the volunteers.
And what we think this area was doing was practically controlling the emotional response. So everyone has an initial emotional response, but there are people that can control this emotional response better with their frontal lobe, and they can just practically approximate a more rational behavior, a more consistent behavior.
The reason that we are able to make rational decisions at all is because of our magnificent frontal lobes. Ours are almost 5 times bigger than our closest relatives. What's more, our unique mix of brain cell types means that our frontal lobes can out-decide even the greatest great ape.
Here are some examples of ways in which health communications can be framed in terms of gains and losses. An example of a gain frame might be an advantage of getting regular mammograms is that you'll find tumors early, which will increase your treatment options. Conversely, an example of a loss frame might be a disadvantage of failing to get regular mammograms is that you won't find tumors early, which will leave you with fewer treatment options. Now with this introduction out of the way, let's look at the decisions you made at the beginning of this video. Here were the choices A and B. In choice A, 200 people will be saved, and in choice B, there's a 1/3 chance that 600 people will be saved and a 2/3 chance that nobody will be saved. For reasons we'll get to soon, theoretically, there's a higher chance that you chose option A than option B. Now here are the choices C and D. In choice C, 400 people will die, and in choice D, there's a 2/3 chance that 600 people will die and a 1/3 chance that nobody will die. In this case, again according to theory, you should have been more likely to choose option D. It's important to recognize that choices A and B were framed as gains. They were stated in terms of how many people would live given each choice. So either 200 people would be saved, or there's a chance that a certain number of people will be saved. Choices C and D, on the other hand, were framed as losses. They were stated in terms of how many people would die given each choice. So either 400 people will die, or there's a certain chance that a certain number of people will die. To make this all a bit clearer, let's look at these choices together. Choices A and C are exactly the same. For choice A, 200 people out of 600 people in total will survive. In choice C, 400 people out of 600 people in total will die, leaving 200 survivors. So in both choices A and C, 200 people will live and 400 people will die. Similarly, options B and D are also mathematically identical. In general, when people are presented with the possibility of gains, they tend to choose the option that is certain rather than taking a gamble. People don't like to gamble with potential gains, so when things are framed as gains, people become risk averse, meaning they tend to avoid risky options. So in the epidemic example, choices A and B are both presented in terms of gains. People end up choosing the certain option, which is choice A, rather than the risky option, which is choice B. Choice B is risky because there is some possibility that everybody will die. So that's what people do when they're presented with the possibility of gains. But what about when they're presented with the possibility of losses? When presented with the possibility of losses, people become more willing to gamble. So when things are framed as losses, people actually seek out risks. They're risk-seeking, and they choose the more risky option. Choices C and D were framed as losses, and people here tend to choose the risky option, which is choice D, rather than the certain option, which is choice C. Choice D is risky because there's some chance that everybody will die. But in choice C, it's certain that 400 people will die. So to sum up, when a message is framed in terms of gains, people tend to become risk averse. But when a message is framed in terms of losses, people tend to become more risk seeking. So the way that you frame your health message could influence the course of action people choose. Here's another example of the effect of message framing. Imagine you have some disease and the doctor says you can have surgery for it, or you can choose some alternative procedure. So, for example, just leaving it alone and hoping that this ailment clears itself up on its own. The doctor can give you the likelihood of the surgery succeeding in one of two ways. He can give it in terms of a loss frame, in which he gives you the likelihood that you will die with 1 year of the surgery. So you have a 32% chance of dying by the end of 1 year after the surgery. Or he can give it to you in terms of a gain frame, in which he gives you the likelihood that you'll live for at least a year after the surgery. So, for example, you have a 68% chance of living for a year after the surgery. So you can see that these two frames are equivalent. If you have a 32% chance of dying, then by definition, you have a 68% chance of living. So people should be just as likely to choose to have the surgery regardless of which frame they get. But this isn't the case, because frames matter. Remember, people are risk-seeking in the domain of losses. So when framed with a loss frame, which is option A here, people should be less likely to choose the surgery than when framed in terms of gains, living. When framed as a loss, people would rather gamble on some other form of treatment, so for example, to do nothing, to avoid this chance of death. When framed as a gain, people will avoid the gamble because they're risk averse and take the 68% chance of survival, which here is option B. And sure enough, when framed as loss, mortality, 58% of participants in this study agreed to the surgery. But when framed as a gain, survival, 75% of people chose the surgery. Now, this study was a hypothetical case. It wasn't real people making real decisions about getting a surgery or some other kind of treatment. So the question is, can these principles be applied to real people making real decisions about their health? And in fact, Research suggests that these principles can be applied to real people making real decisions about their health. However, some issues do come up. First, most decisions we make about our medical care don't involve a choice between two distinct options. Usually there's one thing your doctor recommends, and you either choose to do it or you don't. Second, with many medical decisions, you only have your subjective perception of the risk to base your decisions on, and this perception might not line up with the actual risk levels at all. Even if your doctor can provide you with an estimate of the level of risk, you still depend on your perception of the level of risk when making your decisions. Well, what can we do about this second problem? Well, one thing we can do is consider the risk level of different health behaviors. And health behaviors do vary based on how risky they are. In particular, we can divide them into two main types of health behaviors that are quite different in their risk levels. One type is illness detection behaviors. These are behaviors that tell you if you have an illness. Examples of illness detection behaviors are things like getting a mammogram or an HIV test. Now, of course, it's good to detect an illness if you have one. However, detection behaviors are considered risky to people because if you do these behaviors, you might find out that you have breast cancer or HIV. And if you want somebody to engage in a risk-seeking behavior, you should present these things in terms of losses. And there's lots of research showing that loss-framed messages work better than gain-framed messages in getting people to do detection behaviors. The second kind of behavior is health-promoting behavior. These are behaviors that maintain your health, like getting vaccinated or exercising. Health-promoting behaviors keep you healthy or prevent you from getting certain diseases, so these behaviors aren't risky at all. If you want someone to do a safe, non-risky behavior, you should present it in terms of gains. People are risk-averse in the domain of gains, and lots of research shows that gain-framed messages work better than loss-framed messages when trying to get people to engage in health-promoting behaviors. Rothman et al. Conducted a study that's a perfect example for providing you with evidence that loss-framed messages work best for detection behaviors and gain-framed messages work best for health-promoting behaviors. The researchers were investigating the effect of matching the message frame with a health communication. They used dental hygiene as the health behavior. More specifically, the information they provided to subjects encouraged them to use a mouth rinse to prevent the accumulation of plaque, which could cause gum disease. Specifically, participants were either encouraged to use a mouth rinse or a rinse that makes plaque visible to the naked eye. So, either a rinse that fights cavities, like Listerine, or one of those rinses that makes the plaque on your teeth turn dark blue. So these participants received pamphlets encouraging these kinds of behaviors, and all the pamphlets provided the same information about dental health. For example, how plaque is formed and how cavities develop, the development of gum disease, etc. The only thing that differed was the framed message. Here are examples of what the subjects read in their pamphlets. For the health promotion behavior using the Listerine-like mouth rinse, the gain frame read, "People who use mouth rinse daily are taking advantage of a safe and effective way to reduce plaque accumulation." In the loss frame condition, subjects read, "People who do not use mouth rinse daily are failing to take advantage of a safe and effective way to reduce plaque accumulation." For the illness detection behavior, so using the mouth rinse that turns the plaque on your teeth dark blue. The gain frame red, using a disclosing rinse before brushing enhances your ability to detect areas of plaque accumulation. The loss frame message said, failing to use a disclosing rinse before brushing limits your ability to detect areas of plaque accumulation. So this was actually a really clever design because the prevention behavior and the detection behavior were actually the exact same thing, using a mouth rinse. And in both cases, you're getting people to use this rinse to fight gum disease. After reading the pamphlet, subjects filled out some questionnaires on their response to the messages and their attitudes toward the mouth rinse or disclosing rinse. Then they were given a postcard that they could mail in to get a free sample of the mouth rinse. So these researchers made sure to get survey responses and actual behavioral measures. So specifically measuring the percent of subjects who requested the mouth rinse in the mail. And what they found is exactly what you'd expect. The x-axis of this graph is showing you which condition the participants were in, either the mouth rinse or disclosing rinse condition. The y-axis is telling you the percentage of participants who requested a sample of the rinse by sending in their postcard. The black bars represent participants who read their pamphlets in terms of losses, and the white bars represent participants who read their pamphlets in terms of gains. When participants read about a rinse used to promote health, more participants requested the sample of the rinse if they got the gain-framed message rather than the loss-framed message. And that's what the left two bars are showing you. When participants read about a rinse used to detect a problem, more participants requested the sample of the rinse if they got the loss-framed message rather than the gain-framed message, which is what the right two bars is showing you. In sum, detection behaviors are seen as risky, so loss-framed messages work better than gain-framed messages. Health promotion behaviors are seen as safe, so gain-framed appeals are more effective than loss-framed appeals. As I just said, particular frames work better for different types of behaviors, but now I want to suggest that particular frames might also be more persuasive for different types of people. And in particular, there is one personality measure that can predict what types of messages may be more or less persuasive for certain kinds of people. So first, let's see where you fall on this personality measure. Consider the following two statements. Read them both, and then decide which one better characterizes you. Try to choose just one. If you chose A, that means you're probably what we call approach-oriented. Approach-oriented people are motivated to actively seek out positive and good things. When these people see something they want, they go after them without worrying. If you chose B, that means you're what we call avoidance-oriented. Avoidance-oriented people are motivated by fear of bad things happening, so they actively try to avoid negative outcomes. Now, some of you might be thinking that sometimes you're approach-oriented, and at other times you're avoidance-oriented. That's because these two systems, the approach system and the avoidance system, are thought to be two separate and independent systems. You have an approach system that responds to reward cues, and an avoidance system that responds to punishment cues. Because the systems are independent, you can be both strongly approach-oriented and strongly avoidance-oriented, or neither approach nor avoidance-oriented. But despite that, you can still categorize people as being predominantly approach-oriented or predominantly avoidance-oriented. So the big question for us is Do approach-oriented people prefer a different kind of message framing than avoidance-oriented people? Intuitively, it seems reasonable that people with an approach orientation would show more behavior change after reading a gain-framed message. It also seems intuitive that people with an avoidance orientation would show more behavior change after reading a loss-framed message. There are several studies investigating this question, and many of them have looked at the health behavior of flossing. Now, this might seem like a pretty boring health behavior to look into, but it's useful for a couple of reasons. First, flossing is actually a very important health behavior. It's critical in preventing health disease. But the other, possibly more important reason researchers use flossing as a target health behavior is because subjects in studies have no problem admitting that they have failed to floss, since failing to floss is so incredibly common. There's just no taboo associated with it, unlike the taboos associated with failing to brush your teeth or many other kinds of health behaviors. We're going to focus on a study in which Sherman and colleagues manipulated a flossing message and then measured participants' behavior. First, the researchers measured participants' approach and avoidance orientation, and then they had subjects read one of two messages promoting flossing, either a gain-framed message or a loss-framed message. The flossing messages were designed to look like a web page from a national dental organization. After participants read the messages, they received 7 individually wrapped packets of floss. The researchers told the participants to use these floss packets the next 7 times that they flossed and to not give them away. 1 week later, the researchers contacted the participants to find out how much they had been flossing. Here's an example of their gain-framed message. You can pause it if you want to read this more carefully. And this is an example of their loss-framed message. Again, you can pause the video if you want to read these messages more carefully. As you can see, these two messages are practically identical, except one is discussing the health-promoting benefits of flossing, and the other is describing the prevention benefits of flossing. So what were the results? On this graph, the x-axis is split between the loss-frame article and the gain-frame article. The y-axis is showing you how many of the 7 individually wrapped floss packets participants said they used. What you can see is that avoidance-focused people, the white bars, flossed more after reading the loss-framed article than after reading the gain-framed article, whereas approach-focused people, the grayish bars, flossed more after reading the gain-framed article than the loss-framed article. So both of these frames are effective. They're just differently effective for different kinds of people. Now we're going to move on and talk about the other big issue that affects how people respond to a health communication: defensiveness. If a health message rouses too much fear, if it's too threatening, people sometimes get defensive and just deny that the message pertains to them. The paradox of personal relevance states that the people for whom health-related information is most relevant are the people who are least accepting of the information. This is because the information is simply too threatening for them to take in. It threatens their sense of self. So, for example, what can we do to help smokers, people who feel that smoking is part of their identity, listen to health messages about the dangers of smoking without them becoming defensive? Well, a researcher named Claude Steele thinks he has the answer. He developed a theory called self-affirmation theory. Self-affirmation theory says that the goal of oneself is to maintain one's global self-integrity. Steele suggests that you have this global self-esteem, which is made up of aspects of your self-image from many different domains in your life. Your domains, the domains that are most important to you might be different from the domains that are most important to somebody else. So for example, someone's most important domains might be their health, their friends, their family, and their school life. And they basically derive their self-image from these 4 domains. But again, it's important to recognize that these domains might be different for different kinds of people. So what do people do when they're confronted with information that threatens their sense of self? Well, they could do one of 2 things. First, they can change their health behavior, but this seems unlikely since information that's threatening is going to be unlikely to be acted upon. Or the person could deny or dismiss the health information because it's so threatening and it creates so much fear. It basically just shut down. So how can you get someone to not be defensive about threatening information, but instead take it seriously and use it to their benefit? Self-affirmation theory suggests that when you're faced with health information that's threatening to your self-worth, you should affirm yourself in another domain that's important to your self-image. Steele suggests that this affirmation process makes people less defensive and therefore more able to internalize information that threatens domains that are central to a person's self-image. So, for example, I might affirm you in another domain other than your health. So, for example, before I give you a health message, I can praise you for doing really well in school. By affirming this domain, you're going to become less likely to get defensive when I provide you with a threatening message about your health. And therefore, you'll be more likely to internalize this threatening information. We'll end this video by going over 2 studies that a group of researchers did to test the efficacy of self-affirmation theory within the health domain. In one of their studies, the subjects were sexually active college students. The threatening health information they received was a video about AIDS in young students like themselves. They were randomly assigned to the affirmation condition or a control condition. To get participants to self-affirm, the researchers used a standard affirmation exercise. In this exercise, all the participants looked at a list of different domains that might have value. So things such as family, friends, academics, religion, music, athletics, skills, etc. And they ranked these domains in order of importance. So they would give a 1 to the domain that they valued most, a 2 that they valued second most, etc. Then the subjects assigned to the affirmation condition wrote a short essay about why they valued the thing that they ranked as number 1. The subjects assigned to the control condition, so the condition in which participants were not affirming a value, wrote a short essay about why some other people might value the thing that they ranked as least important. Thus, all the participants wrote an essay with a positive tone. However, the affirmation subjects wrote about what they value, and the non-affirmation subjects wrote about what somebody else might value. After writing their essay, all the subjects were shown a 12-minute AIDS educational video. Then they had subjects fill out some questionnaires, including the question regarding risk perception, how much participants perceived themselves at risk of contracting AIDS. At the end of the session, as subjects were getting ready to leave, they were casually shown a basket of condoms and a set of brochures on HIV prevention. The participants were informed that they could take as many brochures as they wanted and could purchase as many condoms as they wanted for $0.10 a piece. And then they were left alone to do that. The researchers found that participants who were affirmed not only felt like they were most at risk of getting HIV, but they also took more condoms and brochures from the researchers. These results suggest that completing the affirmation not only made participants less defensive about their risk level, but it also made them start to take the necessary steps to make themselves safe. The second study had a similar design. In this case, the subjects were female college students. Participants read an article titled Caffeine in Women, a New Health Risk, which was about how drinking large amounts of coffee puts women at risk for fibrocystic disease, which was thought to be a precursor of breast cancer. This article was totally made up, and it wasn't true, but they presented it to subjects as if it were true. The participants then answered several questions, including some that assessed whether they were accepting, so whether they believed the information in the article, and whether they intended to change their behavior, so drink less coffee if they happen to drink coffee. Because remember, under normal circumstances, only people who feel that the health information is directly relevant to their self-image will feel defensive. So to assess this, the researchers divided subjects into two groups: those who were coffee drinkers and those who weren't coffee drinkers. The information about coffee and breast cancer wouldn't be threatening to women who didn't drink coffee, so we wouldn't expect those women to be more or less accepting of the message based on whether or not they were affirmed. And here are the results. Women who weren't coffee drinkers, so the white bars, were equally accepting of the information regardless of whether they did the affirmation or not. But the women who were coffee drinkers, the grayish bars, for these women, there was a significant difference between the affirmation condition and the control condition. If these coffee drinkers had not been affirmed on some important value, their level of acceptance was a 4.2 on the scale, lower than that of the non-coffee drinkers. But if they had been affirmed on an important value, their level of acceptance was much higher, a 7.2 on this scale, which is even higher than the non-coffee drinkers. So doing this self-affirmation made the exact women who were at risk for this health problem more accepting of this information. The group of people who you would expect to be most defensive about this information were actually the most accepting of it. They also looked at whether the women who were coffee drinkers said they intended to change their behavior based on this information. The women who would have affirmed some aspect of their self were much more likely to report a desire to change their behavior. So these two studies together suggest that simply affirming some valued aspect of the self actually makes people respond better to health communications that threaten the self. This means that health communicators don't have to make their communications less threatening to bring down their audience's defenses. All they have to do is to make their audience feel better about some other important aspect of themselves.